The people who laugh at your downfall rarely imagine they might one day report to your success. The ballroom glowed beneath towering crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Laughter drifted through the air. Glasses clinked softly. A string quartet played near the stage while executives, investors, and their guests filled the luxurious venue with effortless confidence. It was supposed to be a celebration. At least that was what the invitation promised. For Victoria Hayes, it felt more like standing in the center of a storm she could not yet see. She adjusted the sleeve of her navy dress and glanced around the room. The annual leadership gala had always been important to Jason. Every year he treated it like a public display of achievement. Every year Victoria stood beside him smiling for photographs, greeting clients, remembering names, and helping create the polished image that contributed to his growing reputation. Tonight felt different. For weeks, Jason had been distant. Conversations ended quickly. Dinners became silent. Long evenings at the office stretched even longer. Victoria sensed something changing, but she could not identify exactly what it was. Across the ballroom, Jason stood surrounded by colleagues. His charcoal suit looked perfectly tailored. His smile appeared relaxed. Yet when Victoria caught his eye, he quickly looked away. A strange feeling settled into her chest. Nearby, whispers began moving through small groups of guests. Curious glances followed. Several people exchanged looks before turning toward the entrance. Victoria followed their gaze. The ballroom doors opened. A young woman stepped inside wearing an elegant silver dress. She looked confident, glamorous, and completely comfortable with the attention she immediately attracted. Victoria did not recognize her. Jason clearly did. To Victoria's surprise, he walked directly toward the woman and greeted her with an enthusiasm she had not seen in months. Conversations slowed throughout the room. The string quartet continued playing, but something else now occupied everyone's attention. Victoria remained motionless. Her heart began beating faster. Jason offered the woman his arm and guided her through the crowd. Then he did something Victoria never expected. He brought her directly toward the center of the ballroom. Toward the stage. Toward the microphone. The room gradually quieted. Guests turned in anticipation. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. Jason stepped onto the stage and accepted the microphone from the event host. A confident smile crossed his face. "Before tonight continues," he said, "there is someone I would like everyone to meet." A few people exchanged excited looks. Victoria stood frozen. The young woman joined Jason on stage. He placed a hand gently against her shoulder and smiled. "This is Samantha Reed." Applause scattered politely throughout the room. Victoria still did not understand. Then Jason continued speaking. "Many of you know the past year has brought significant changes to my life." A few guests nodded knowingly. Others leaned forward in their seats. Victoria suddenly realized she could barely breathe. "Sometimes," Jason said, "life moves in a new direction, and we have to embrace opportunities for happiness." He turned toward Samantha. "I am grateful for the future we are building together." Silence seemed to crash into Victoria all at once. Around the room, understanding spread instantly. People glanced toward her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. A few appeared sympathetic. The humiliation arrived not through cruelty, but through attention. Hundreds of eyes suddenly knowing something she had not been prepared to hear publicly. Victoria felt heat rise into her face. Jason never mentioned her name. Somehow that made it worse. He did not need to. Everyone already knew. The woman standing alone near the back of the ballroom was his wife. At least for now. Whispers began spreading again. Victoria heard fragments. "I cannot believe he did this here. Does she know? This is awkward. Poor Victoria." She lowered her gaze for a moment. Every instinct urged her to run. To disappear. To escape the crushing weight of public embarrassment. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin. She refused to give the room the breakdown they expected. Jason continued speaking while applause followed his announcement. Samantha smiled brightly beneath the lights. Photographers moved closer. Cameras flashed. The scene looked like the beginning of a fairy tale for some people. For Victoria, it felt like the end of an era. Quietly, she picked up her purse from the nearby table. No dramatic confrontation. No raised voice. No tears. She simply walked toward the exit while the celebration continued behind her. Nobody tried to stop her. Outside, cool evening air greeted her as she stepped onto the terrace overlooking the city skyline. Portland shimmered beneath the night sky, beautiful and indifferent. Victoria rested her hands against the railing and stared at the light stretching toward the horizon. For the first time all evening, tears threatened to appear. She blinked them away. Behind her, music resumed. Laughter returned. Life continued. Yet standing alone beneath the stars, Victoria Hayes felt something unexpected beneath the pain. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter. A realization. The chapter ending tonight was not the story of her destruction. It was only the story of her departure. And somewhere beyond the city lights, a future she could not yet imagine was already waiting for her. The morning after public humiliation always feels strangely quiet. Not because the world has stopped moving, but because it continues exactly as before while your own life has changed forever. Victoria Hayes woke before sunrise inside the large house she still technically shared with Jason. Pale morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting soft shadows across walls that suddenly felt unfamiliar. For several moments she remained still, staring at the ceiling. The events from the gala returned immediately. The stage. The applause. Samantha standing beside Jason. Hundreds of eyes turning toward her. She closed her eyes briefly and exhaled. Somewhere downstairs, a coffee machine started brewing automatically. The familiar sound felt almost painful. For years, mornings followed the same routine. Victoria prepared breakfast. Jason checked emails. They discussed schedules and meetings. Ordinary habits built over more. Then a decade of marriage. Now every memory seemed to belong to someone else. She sat up slowly and noticed Jason's side of the bed remained untouched. He had not come home. Surprisingly, that realization did not shock her. Deep down, she already knew. A few hours later, Victoria sat alone at the kitchen table holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The house felt too large. Too quiet. Too empty. Around her were reminders of a life she had spent years helping build. Family photographs. Awards displayed on shelves. Framed articles celebrating Jason's professional achievements. Looking around, Victoria noticed something she had never fully recognized before. Nearly every visible success in the house carried Jason's name. Yet behind many of those achievements stood countless sacrifices nobody ever saw. Late nights helping organize presentations. Business dinners attended as a supportive partner. Networking events managed with grace and patience. Years spent putting someone else's ambitions first. A key turned in the front door. Jason entered carrying a small overnight bag. For a moment neither spoke. The silence stretched across the room. Finally, Jason placed the bag near the staircase. "We should talk." Victoria nodded. "Yes. We should." He sat across from her. His expression appeared calm, almost rehearsed. Victoria wondered how long he had prepared for this conversation. "I did not intend for last night to happen that way," he began. Victoria looked at him quietly. "You walked onto a stage." Jason lowered his eyes briefly. "I know. You introduced another woman in front of everyone we know. Another silence followed. Jason rubbed his hands together. I never wanted to hurt you. Victoria almost smiled at the irony. People often say that after making choices guaranteed to cause pain. And yet here we are. Jason did not argue. Instead, he stared toward the window overlooking the backyard. Things have been changing for a long time. Victoria listened. Not because she expected answers. Because she wanted clarity. I think we became different people. Jason continued. The relationship stopped working. Victoria nodded slowly. She could have listed every warning sign herself. The distance. The missed conversations. The emotional absence. Yet none of those things justified what happened at the gala. Jason eventually spoke the words she had expected. I want a divorce. Hearing them out loud still hurt. Not because she was surprised. Because some small part of her had hoped reality might be less cruel than anticipation. She set her coffee mug down carefully. How long? Jason hesitated. Several months. Victoria absorbed the answer. Months. While she continued believing they were struggling through a difficult season, he had already begun building a new future. Later that afternoon, after lawyers were contacted and practical discussions began, Victoria walked through the house alone. Sunlight spilled across hardwood floors. The rooms looked exactly as they had the day before. Yet everything felt different. In the primary bedroom, she opened a closet and removed several storage boxes. In the office, she gathered personal notebooks and photographs. In the kitchen, she paused beside the refrigerator where family vacation pictures remained attached by magnets. One image caught her attention. It showed a younger version of herself smiling beside Jason during a trip to Seattle years earlier. They looked happy. Hopeful. Certain. Victoria studied the photograph for several seconds before placing it gently inside a box. Not because she wanted to erase the memory. Because she finally understood that memory belonged to the past. Over the following weeks, the divorce process moved forward with surprising speed. Friends chose sides. Invitations disappeared. Phone calls became less frequent. Some people offered sympathy. Others offered curiosity disguised as concern. Victoria learned quickly that public humiliation rarely ends after a single night. It echoes through conversations long afterward. Eventually, she moved into a small apartment across town. The first evening there, surrounded by unopened boxes and unfamiliar walls, she sat alone beside a window overlooking the city. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Traffic lights reflected on wet streets below. For the first time since leaving the house, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The tears lasted only a few minutes. Then something unexpected happened. The sadness remained, but beneath it she sensed another emotion beginning to emerge. Determination. Small. Fragile. Almost invisible. Yet unmistakably present. Victoria wiped her eyes and looked out toward the distant skyline. Somewhere beyond those lights, a different future existed. She could not see it yet. She could not imagine it yet. But for the first time since that terrible night, she realized something important. Jason had ended a chapter of her life. He had not ended her story. Rain became a regular companion during Victoria Hayes's first months alone. Nearly every evening, droplets traced slow paths down the windows of her small apartment while the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white beyond the glass. The apartment was nothing like the home she once shared with Jason. The kitchen was smaller. The furniture was modest. The view overlooked a busy street instead of a private neighborhood. Yet strangely, the space felt more honest. Every item inside belonged to her. Every decision was hers. Every quiet moment belonged only to the future she had yet to build. The weeks following the divorce were not dramatic. There were no miraculous opportunities. No sudden success. No life-changing phone calls. Instead, there were ordinary mornings filled with uncertainty. Victoria updated her resume. She attended networking events where few people recognized her. She applied for consulting projects and temporary assignments. More than once, she questioned whether she was moving forward at all. One Tuesday afternoon, she sat inside a small coffee shop reviewing financial reports for a short-term contract position. Outside, pedestrians hurried through cold autumn weather. Inside, conversations blended with the sound of espresso machines and soft music. Victoria studied spreadsheets while making notes in a worn notebook she carried everywhere. A young employee approached her table. "You are here almost every day." Victoria smiled politely. "I guess I am." "Working on something important?" the employee asked. Victoria glanced at the notebook. For a moment she considered saying no. Instead, she answered honestly. "Trying to figure out what comes next." The employee nodded thoughtfully before returning to work. The simple exchange lingered in Victoria's mind long afterward. What came next? For years, her identity had been connected to roles she no longer occupied. Wife. Partner. Support system. Social hostess. Now she faced a question she had avoided for most of her adult life. Who was Victoria Hayes when nobody else defined her? That evening she returned home carrying groceries and a folder of unfinished work. The apartment remained quiet except for distant traffic drifting through partially opened windows. After dinner, she sat beside the window with her notebook. For nearly an hour she stared at a blank page. Then she finally wrote a single sentence. "I do not want my story to end here." She looked at the words for several moments before continuing. Page after page filled with thoughts she had never spoken aloud. Goals. Fears. Ideas. Regrets. Possibilities. Somewhere between those lines, something began changing. Not her circumstances. Not yet. Herself. Over the following months, Victoria developed routines that slowly rebuilt her confidence. Early morning walks before work. Professional development courses during evenings. Industry seminars on weekends. While others relaxed, she studied market trends, leadership strategies, and corporate growth models. The process felt slow. Sometimes painfully slow. Yet every small improvement created momentum. Winter arrived. Then spring. One afternoon, Victoria attended a regional business conference hosted in downtown Portland. The event attracted entrepreneurs, consultants, investors, and executives from across the Pacific Northwest. Victoria almost skipped it. The registration fee stretched her budget. The thought of spending an entire day surrounded by successful professionals felt intimidating. In the end, she forced herself to go. The conference center buzzed with activity. Presentations filled multiple rooms. Industry leaders discussed innovation, investment, and economic trends. Victoria spent the morning taking notes and listening carefully. During a panel discussion about organizational growth, one speaker made a statement that immediately caught her attention. Most companies fail because they solve the wrong problems. Victoria wrote the sentence down instantly. After the session ended, attendees gathered in the lobby for networking. Small groups formed throughout the room. Business cards exchanged hands. Conversations flowed naturally. Victoria stood near a coffee station reviewing her notes when she noticed an older gentleman studying the same presentation materials. His silver hair and calm demeanor gave him the appearance of someone accustomed to leadership. He glanced toward her notebook. "You took more notes than anyone in that room." Victoria laughed softly. "Occupational habit." "Consultant?" he asked. "Trying to become one." The man smiled. Interesting answer. Their conversation lasted only 15 minutes. They discussed business strategy, leadership challenges, and organizational culture. The man asked thoughtful questions. Victoria answered honestly. By the time the discussion ended, she realized she had spoken more passionately about business than she had in years. Before leaving, the gentleman handed her a card. "It was a pleasure meeting you." Victoria glanced down. Richard Coleman. Chairman. Coleman Capital Partners. Her eyes widened slightly. The name was well known throughout the business community. Richard noticed her reaction and smiled. "Send me your thoughts on today's panel discussion." Victoria looked up. "You want my thoughts?" "Absolutely." He adjusted his jacket. "Most people repeat what they heard. You were analyzing it." With that, he disappeared into the crowd. Victoria stood motionless holding the card. Outside, sunlight reflected against the glass buildings of downtown Portland. For the first time since the divorce, she felt something stronger than determination. Possibility. Later that evening, rain began falling again as she sat beside her apartment window. The business card rested on the table beside her notebook. She stared at both for a long time before opening the notebook and writing another sentence beneath the one she had written months earlier. Maybe. The life I lost was never meant to be my final destination. For the first time in a very long while, the future no longer looked empty. It looked open. The business card remained on Victoria Hayes's kitchen table for 3 days before she finally gathered the courage to send the email. Not because she doubted her ideas. Because opportunities capable of changing a life often arrive disguised as ordinary moments, and part of her feared she might somehow ruin this one. On the 4th evening, after returning from a consulting assignment, she opened her laptop and reread the notes she had taken during the conference. Then she spent nearly 2 hours writing a detailed analysis of the panel discussion Richard Coleman had referenced. She examined leadership failures, organizational blind spots, and strategic growth patterns. She challenged several conclusions made by the speakers. She offered alternative perspectives. Most importantly, she wrote honestly. When she finally pressed send, the city outside her apartment had already disappeared into darkness. Victoria closed the laptop and tried not to think about it. The response arrived the next morning. Richard's message contained only 2 sentences. Interesting observations. Would you be available for lunch on Thursday? Victoria stared at the screen for several seconds before reading the message again. Then a third time. By Thursday afternoon, she found herself seated inside a quiet restaurant overlooking the Willamette River. Large windows filled the dining room with natural light while sailboats drifted slowly across the water outside. Richard arrived precisely on time. He greeted her warmly before taking a seat across the table. Their conversation quickly moved beyond the conference. They discussed leadership psychology, market positioning, organizational culture, and business transformation. Richard asked difficult questions. Victoria answered thoughtfully. More than once, he nodded without speaking while she explained an idea. By the end of lunch, Victoria realized something unusual had happened. Nobody had spent the afternoon discussing her divorce. Nobody asked about Jason. Nobody treated her as someone's former wife. Richard spoke to her as a professional. As an equal. As someone whose ideas carried value. Before leaving, he offered a proposal. "I would like your help reviewing several companies in our investment portfolio." Victoria blinked. "You do?" Richard smiled. "That sounds like surprise." "It is." "Good." He stood and adjusted his jacket. The people worth hiring rarely expect opportunities to be handed to them. That single project became 2. Then 3. Over the following months, Victoria began consulting for several companies connected to Coleman Capital Partners. Some organizations struggled with leadership issues. Others faced growth challenges. A few were successful but needed strategic direction. Victoria approached each assignment the same way. She listened carefully. Observed patiently. Identified problems others overlooked. Her recommendations were practical, detailed, and effective. Slowly, results began following her work. One company improved employee retention. Another increased profitability. A third successfully expanded into new markets. Richard noticed. So did everyone else. Summer arrived. Then another autumn. Victoria's small apartment gradually changed. The second-hand furniture was replaced. The worn dining table disappeared. Professional books filled shelves. Her calendar became increasingly crowded with meetings and consulting engagements. Yet despite the growing success, she never forgot how everything began. The notebook remained beside her bed. Every major goal. Every lesson. Every setback. Every victory. All documented in its pages. One rainy evening, nearly 2 years after the divorce, Victoria attended a private leadership retreat organized by Richard. Executives from multiple industries gathered at a mountain resort outside Portland. The atmosphere felt intimate compared to large conferences. Conversations became deeper. Relationships became stronger. During a discussion about future leadership talent, several executives praised Victoria's work openly. She listened quietly while they spoke. Richard sat across the room observing. Later that evening, after most attendees had retired for the night, he found Victoria standing alone on a covered terrace overlooking pine forest stretching into darkness. Rain tapped softly against the roof above them. "You have become very difficult to ignore," Richard said. Victoria laughed. "That sounds dangerous." "It sounds earned." He leaned against the railing. "Do you know why I first spoke to you at that conference?" Victoria shook her head. Richard looked toward the distant mountains. Everyone else was listening for answers. "You were listening for flaws." Victoria smiled. "That does not sound flattering." "It is in business." He paused briefly. "Most people accept the surface of things. You never do." The conversation lingered with her long after he left. That night, back in her room, Victoria opened her notebook again. She reread entries written during the painful months after the divorce. The uncertainty. The loneliness. The fear. The woman who wrote those pages felt familiar and distant at the same time. She was still Victoria Hayes. Yet she was also someone different now. Stronger. More confident. More capable. Not because life had become easier. Because she had become better at facing difficult things. The next morning, Richard requested a private meeting before the retreat ended. They sat together inside a conference room overlooking the forest. Sunlight filtered through tall windows while attendees prepared for departure outside. Richard placed a folder on the table between them. "I believe you are ready for something bigger." Victoria looked down at the folder. Inside were financial reports, organizational charts, and acquisition documents connected to one of the largest companies in Richard's portfolio. Her eyes widened slightly. "This is not a consulting assignment." Richard smiled. "No," Victoria looked back at him. "Then what is it?" Richard folded his hands. "It is the beginning of your next chapter." As morning sunlight spread across the conference table, Victoria felt the same sensation she experienced when she first received his business card years earlier. Possibility. Only now, it no longer felt distant. It was sitting directly in front of her. The folder Richard Coleman placed on the conference table changed the direction of Victoria Hayes's life long before she fully understood its significance. During the drive back to Portland after the leadership retreat, the documents remained secured inside her briefcase on the passenger seat. Every stoplight seemed longer than usual. Every mile gave her another reason to question whether she was ready. The company described inside the reports was not a small operation struggling to survive. It was a regional manufacturing and logistics firm employing hundreds of people across multiple states. Revenue remained strong, but growth had stalled. Leadership turnover had increased. Employee morale had declined. Investors were growing impatient. Several consultants had already attempted to solve the problems without lasting success. Richard believed Victoria could help. The responsibility felt enormous. That evening she spread the documents across her dining table and began reading. Hours passed unnoticed. Financial statements led to operational reports. Operational reports led to employee surveys. Employee surveys revealed patterns that most analysts overlooked. By midnight, Victoria had filled several pages of notes. By 2 a.m, she noticed something important. The company was not suffering from a market problem. It was suffering from a leadership problem. The next morning she called Richard. "I think I found the real issue." Richard laughed softly. "That only took you 12 hours. Nobody is listening to the people doing the work." "Exactly." Victoria stared out her apartment window. "You already knew." "I suspected." Richard paused. "I wanted to see if you would find it." Over the following months, Victoria immersed herself in the project. She traveled frequently between offices, warehouses, and distribution centers. Unlike previous consultants, she spent less time in executive conference rooms and more time speaking with employees. Supervisors. Drivers. Administrative staff. Operations managers. She asked questions. She listened carefully. She observed. Gradually, trust began forming. Employees who initially viewed her with skepticism started sharing honest feedback. Executives who resisted change slowly recognized the value of her. Recommendations. The work was demanding. Flights before sunrise became common. Hotel rooms replaced weekends at home. Some days stretched 12 or 14 hours. Yet Victoria felt energized rather than exhausted. For the first time in years, she was building something entirely her own. One afternoon, while presenting a strategic roadmap to the company's board of directors, Victoria noticed a familiar feeling returning. Confidence. Not the fragile confidence built on praise. The deeper kind earned through preparation and experience. She answered difficult questions without hesitation. She defended recommendations with clarity. She challenged assumptions respectfully but firmly. When the meeting ended, several board members remained behind. One director approached her directly. "You should be leading companies, not just advising them." Victoria smiled politely. The comment stayed with her long afterward. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward outside of work. The apartment that once felt temporary now felt like home. New friendships formed. Professional relationships expanded. The painful memories of the divorce gradually lost their sharp edges. They still existed, but they no longer controlled her. Occasionally, she would hear updates about Jason through mutual acquaintances. Bennett Consulting continued performing well. Jason and Samantha appeared regularly at social events. Their photographs occasionally surfaced online. Years earlier, seeing those images would have ruined her day. Now she rarely paid attention. Her focus remained fixed on where she was going rather than where she had been. Nearly 3 years after leaving the gala, the project reached a turning point. The company Victoria helped transform reported its strongest performance in nearly a decade. Revenue increased. Employee retention improved dramatically. Investor confidence returned. Industry publications began covering the turnaround story. During interviews, executives repeatedly mentioned one name. Victoria Hayes. At first, the recognition felt uncomfortable. She preferred solving problems to discussing achievements. Yet the attention brought new opportunities. Additional companies requested her expertise. Investors sought her perspective. Leadership conferences invited her to speak. The professional world that once seemed impossibly distant was now opening its doors. One evening, Richard invited Victoria to dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. The atmosphere felt relaxed compared to their usual meetings. As sunset reflected across the water, he raised a glass and smiled. "You know your life is changing, right?" Victoria laughed softly. "I think it already changed." "No," Richard shook his head. "That was only the beginning." He slid another folder across the table. Victoria immediately recognized the gesture and smiled. "Should I be nervous?" "Probably." She opened the folder. This time, the contents were far more substantial. Corporate acquisition opportunities. Investment structures. Executive leadership positions. Strategic ownership pathways. Victoria slowly turned the pages while the reality settled in. These were not consulting assignments. These were opportunities to build influence at an entirely different level. Richard watched her carefully. Most people spend their lives trying to be invited into the room. Victoria looked up. "And? You are getting close to owning the room." The words lingered between them while city lights gradually illuminated the river beyond the windows. Years earlier, Victoria sat alone in a small apartment wondering whether her story had ended. Now she was staring at possibilities larger than anything she once imagined. The distance between those two versions of herself felt almost impossible to measure. Yet she knew exactly how she traveled it. One decision at a time. One difficult day at a time. One act of courage at a time. And although she did not realize it yet, somewhere across the city, Jason Hayes was about to hear her name in a way that would make ignoring her success impossible. Success announces itself differently than failure. Failure often arrives loudly, demanding attention from everyone nearby. Success tends to spread quietly at first, moving through conversations before it ever appears in headlines. Victoria Hayes learned that lesson during the years that followed her. Transformation from consultant to executive leader. Opportunities continued multiplying. Companies requested her guidance. Investors sought her opinion. Industry publications featured her work. Yet most people never witnessed the thousands of decisions, sacrifices, and long nights that made those achievements possible. They only saw the results. One autumn morning, nearly 5 years after the night she left the gala alone, Victoria stood inside a conference room overlooking downtown Portland. Around the table sat attorneys, investors, financial analysts, and senior executives. Stacks of documents covered polished wood surfaces. Coffee cups sat beside laptops. The atmosphere felt serious but optimistic. Months of negotiations were approaching their conclusion. Victoria reviewed the final pages carefully before signing her name. Across from her, Richard Coleman watched quietly. Once the last signature was completed, one of the attorneys smiled. "Congratulations." Another executive extended a hand. "This officially closes the acquisition." Victoria accepted the handshake while reality slowly settled around her. The company she helped transform years earlier now belonged to a newly formed investment group where she held the largest leadership position and significant ownership authority. It was not merely a promotion. It was influence. Responsibility. Control. The kind of opportunity she once believed existed only for other people. After the meeting ended, Richard joined her near the window overlooking the city. "How does it feel?" he asked. Victoria considered the question. "Heavy." Richard laughed softly. "That is probably the correct answer." He glanced toward the skyline. "A lot of people think success feels like a finish line." Victoria nodded. "It feels more like a starting line." Richard smiled. "Exactly." Over the following months, Victoria stepped fully into executive leadership. The transition demanded more than intelligence. It required vision. Difficult decisions became routine. Strategic planning sessions stretched late into the evening. Major investments carried significant risks. Yet the same qualities that made her an exceptional consultant also made her an effective leader. She listened before speaking. She observed before acting. She focused on long-term outcomes rather than short-term appearances. Employees respected her. Investors trusted her. Results continued improving. Meanwhile, life inside Bennett Consulting looked very different. Jason Hayes remained successful by most standards. His company still generated strong revenue. Clients continued arriving. Yet growth had gradually slowed. Competition increased. Market conditions shifted. New challenges emerged. Nothing catastrophic happened. Nothing dramatic. Just the steady reality that success required constant adaptation. One afternoon, Jason attended a regional leadership conference attended by executives from across the Pacific Northwest. The event included keynote speakers, panel discussions, and networking sessions. During a break between presentations, he joined a group of business leaders discussing recent acquisitions and corporate expansions. One executive mentioned a rapidly growing investment organization making significant moves throughout the region. Their leadership team is impressive, the executive said. Especially Victoria Hayes. Jason's expression remained neutral. Inside, however, his attention sharpened immediately. He had heard her name before. Many times. Yet the frequency seemed to be increasing. What company is she with? Jason asked casually. The executive looked surprised. You have not been following that story? Another person joined the conversation. She has become one of the most influential executives in the region. Jason forced a polite smile. I must have missed it. The group laughed. Then you have some reading to do. Later that evening, curiosity finally overcame indifference. Sitting alone in his office, Jason opened several business publications online. Article after article appeared. Strategic acquisitions. Leadership interviews. Industry awards. Corporate growth initiatives. The same name appeared repeatedly. Victoria Hayes. Photographs accompanied many of the stories. Victoria speaking at conferences. Victoria meeting with investors. Victoria leading executive discussions. She looked confident. Focused. Comfortable. Not because she was pretending. Because she belonged there. Jason leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. Something felt strangely unreal. The woman featured throughout those articles seemed completely different from the person he remembered. Yet the more he read, the more he realized the opposite might be true. Perhaps she had always possessed these abilities. Perhaps he simply never noticed. Across town, Victoria prepared for another major announcement. Her organization had completed negotiations involving one of the most significant acquisitions in company history. The transaction would reshape multiple businesses throughout the region. Public details remained confidential. Industry speculation continued growing. Investors wanted answers. Media outlets anticipated news. Inside executive circles, one question dominated conversations. Who was leading the acquisition strategy? Victoria remained silent. The time for announcements had not arrived. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she returned home and opened the notebook that had traveled beside her for years. Many pages were filled now. Goals achieved. Lessons learned. Challenges overcome. She flipped back to the earliest entries written during the painful months after the divorce. The handwriting looked slightly different. The emotions felt distant. Yet she remembered every word. Every fear. Every uncertainty. Every promise she made to herself. A small smile crossed her face. Then she closed the notebook and looked out toward the city lights beyond her window. Somewhere across town, people were beginning to talk about her. Soon they would learn much more. And among those paying attention would be the one person who never imagined she could build a future larger than the life he left behind. The rumors began spreading long before the official announcement. In executive circles, information rarely stayed hidden for long. Investors talked. Analysts speculated. Journalists searched for clues. Somewhere behind closed doors, a major acquisition was taking shape, and everyone wanted to know who was responsible. What nobody realized was that the person guiding the deal was someone many of them already knew by name but had never truly paid attention to before. Victoria Hayes remained focused on the work itself. She spent her days reviewing financial reports, meeting with leadership teams, and negotiating terms that would determine the future of multiple organizations. The acquisition was larger than anything she had handled before. Thousands of jobs could be affected. Entire corporate structures would be reshaped. Every decision carried consequences. While reporters searched for headlines, Victoria concentrated on details. That was where success always lived. One rainy Tuesday morning, she arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city skyline remained wrapped in gray clouds while office lights slowly illuminated the surrounding buildings. Her executive floor was quiet. Most employees had not yet arrived. Victoria carried a cup of coffee into the conference room and spread acquisition documents across the table. The room overlooked the river. Years earlier, she had stared at similar views from a small apartment wondering how she would survive. Now she was preparing to oversee one of the most significant corporate transactions in the region. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Yet she rarely allowed herself to dwell on it. Around 8 o'clock, Richard Coleman entered carrying a folder. "You beat everyone here again." Victoria smiled. "Someone has to." Richard placed the folder beside her. The board approved the final structure. Victoria opened it immediately. After months of preparation, the acquisition had officially received authorization. One final public announcement remained. Richard watched her review the documents. "How are you feeling?" Victoria considered the question carefully. "Ready." Richard nodded with obvious satisfaction. "Good answer." Across town, Jason Hayes sat inside his own office reviewing quarterly performance reports. Business remained steady, though growth continued slowing compared to previous years. Competition had intensified. Market conditions had changed. New players were emerging. One company in particular seemed to appear everywhere. Their acquisitions attracted attention. Their investments generated headlines. Their leadership team earned increasing praise. During a meeting with senior advisors, the conversation eventually shifted toward the same topic. "Whoever is running their strategy division is brilliant," one executive remarked. Another nodded. "They keep finding opportunities everyone else misses." Jason listened quietly. "Do we know who is leading it?" The room exchanged uncertain looks. "Not officially. Nobody seemed sure. The announcement is supposed to happen next month." Jason leaned back in his chair. For reasons he could not fully explain, his curiosity continued growing. Meanwhile, preparations for the public unveiling accelerated. Invitations were sent to investors, executives, media outlets, and business leaders throughout the Pacific Northwest. The venue chosen for the announcement was one of the largest corporate event spaces in Portland. Attendance expectations exceeded every previous gathering. Industry publications described the upcoming event as potentially transformative for the regional business landscape. Victoria received updates daily. Guest lists expanded. Security plans developed. Presentation schedules finalized. Through it all, she remained surprisingly calm. Not because the event lacked importance. Because she no longer measured her worth by public reactions. Years ago, she desperately wanted recognition. Now recognition felt secondary to purpose. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Victoria returned home and opened the notebook she had carried through every stage of her journey. She turned slowly through the pages. The early entries still carried traces of heartbreak, fear, uncertainty, loneliness. Further along, the tone gradually shifted. Curiosity replaced despair. Determination replaced self-doubt. Eventually confidence appeared. Looking back, Victoria realized something profound. The transformation did not begin when Richard Coleman offered an opportunity. It began when she decided her future deserved effort even when success seemed impossible. The next morning, a major business publication released an article discussing the upcoming acquisition. Analysts speculated about ownership structures, industry. Experts debated leadership implications. One paragraph caught Jason's attention immediately. According to multiple sources, Victoria Hayes was expected to play a central role in the announcement. Jason read the sentence twice. Then a third time. For several moments he simply stared at the screen. Her name no longer appeared occasionally. It now appeared everywhere. Conferences. Articles. Investments. Acquisitions. Leadership forums. He remembered the woman standing alone near the back of the ballroom years earlier while whispers spread through the crowd. The contrast felt impossible to reconcile. Later that evening, Samantha mentioned receiving an invitation to the upcoming announcement event. Everyone important seems to be attending, she said while scrolling through her phone. Jason nodded absent-mindedly. I noticed. Samantha looked up. We should go. Jason hesitated before answering. Yes. I think we should. Neither realized how significant that decision would become. Across the city, Victoria stood beside her apartment window watching rain drift across the glass. The lights of Portland reflected against the river below. Tomorrow would bring more meetings. More negotiations. More preparation. Soon the announcement would become public. Soon the speculation would end. Soon everyone would discover who stood behind the acquisition reshaping the business landscape. Victoria closed her notebook and placed it carefully on the shelf. The woman who once left a ballroom feeling humiliated and forgotten was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and far more powerful than anyone expected. And very soon, an entire room would witness exactly how far she had come. The morning of the announcement arrived with the kind of energy that could be felt long before the first guest entered the building. Downtown Portland buzzed with anticipation. Financial reporters gathered outside the event venue. Camera crews adjusted equipment. Executives from across the region arrived in dark suits and polished shoes, exchanging theories about the acquisition everyone had been discussing for months. Inside the grand ballroom, technicians completed final preparations. Massive screens displayed company logos. Rows of seats stretched across the floor beneath elegant lighting. The atmosphere felt less like a corporate event and more like the unveiling of something historic. Victoria Hayes arrived through a private entrance shortly after sunrise. She wore a tailored ivory suit, simple and elegant, with no intention of drawing attention through appearance alone. She no longer needed to. Her reputation would do that for her. As she walked through backstage corridors, staff members greeted her respectfully. Executives paused conversations when she entered rooms. Advisors reviewed schedules one final time. Yet despite the significance of the day, Victoria felt remarkably calm. Years earlier, standing in another ballroom, she had experienced public humiliation beneath bright lights and curious eyes. Today, she stood in a similar environment, but everything about her had changed. She was no longer waiting for someone else's approval. She was walking into a room she helped build. Across the city, Jason Hayes and Samantha Reed arrived at the venue shortly before the program began. The invitation had described the event as a major corporate announcement with significant implications for the regional business community. Neither knew exactly what would be revealed. Like everyone else, they had come expecting answers. The ballroom quickly filled. Investors occupied front-row seats. Journalists positioned themselves near media platforms. Executives gathered in small groups discussing rumors and possibilities. Jason recognized many familiar faces. Several conversations stopped momentarily as he approached. More than once, he heard Victoria's name mentioned nearby. Each time, curiosity tightened slightly inside his chest. The lights dimmed. Conversations faded. Guests gradually returned to their seats. Soft music played through the sound system while event organizers took positions near the stage. A large screen illuminated at the front of the ballroom. The opening presentation began. Financial highlights appeared first. Market projections followed. Then came details regarding the acquisition itself. Company names appeared. Investment structures were explained. Revenue forecasts drew visible reactions from the audience. Journalists typed rapidly. Executives exchanged surprised looks. The scale of the transaction exceeded expectations. Jason listened carefully, increasingly impressed despite himself. Whoever orchestrated this deal possessed remarkable vision. Finally, the presenter reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. This acquisition represents more than growth, he announced. It represents a new chapter of leadership. The screen behind him transitioned to a simple image displaying only a company logo. Today, we are proud to introduce the executive responsible for guiding this transformation. The room became completely silent. Investors leaned forward. Reporters prepared cameras. Even the air itself seemed to pause. Backstage, Victoria took a slow breath. Not from nervousness. From gratitude. Gratitude for every difficult day that brought her here. Every setback. Every sacrifice. Every lesson. She remembered the small apartment. The notebook. The lonely nights. The uncertainty. She remembered walking away from humiliation with nothing except determination. Then she stepped forward. The presenter smiled toward the audience. Please welcome our Chief Executive Officer, Victoria Hayes. For a fraction of a second, silence remained. Then the ballroom erupted into applause. Victoria walked onto the stage beneath brilliant lights. Hundreds of people rose from their seats. Cameras flashed continuously. Investors applauded. Executives nodded with admiration. Journalists immediately began taking photographs. She crossed the stage with calm confidence and accepted the microphone. Near the center of the audience, Jason stopped breathing for a moment. Samantha stared at the stage in disbelief. Around them, applause continued building. Jason had seen photographs. He had read articles. Yet nothing prepared him for this reality. Victoria was not merely involved. She was the leader. The architect. The person everyone had come to hear. The woman he once believed could not succeed without him now stood at the center of one of the largest business announcements in the region. Victoria looked across the crowd. Her eyes moved naturally over hundreds of faces. Investors. Executives. Reporters. Colleagues. Eventually, she noticed Jason seated among them. Their eyes met briefly. No anger appeared in her expression. No bitterness. No desire for revenge. Only calm recognition. Then she continued looking across the audience. The moment lasted less than a second, yet it told an entire story. Victoria began speaking. Her voice carried clearly throughout the ballroom. She discussed vision. Opportunity. Growth. Leadership. Not once did she mention the past. Not once did she reference personal struggles. The speech focused entirely on the future. That, more than anything else, left Jason speechless. He had expected resentment. Instead, he witnessed something far more powerful. Freedom. As the presentation continued, reporters filled pages with notes. Investors exchanged excited reactions. Business leaders discussed future partnerships. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to admiration. By the time Victoria concluded her remarks, the room stood once again in applause. This time the ovation lasted even longer. Standing beneath the lights, Victoria accepted the recognition with quiet grace. Years earlier, another ballroom had witnessed her lowest moment. Today, a different ballroom witnessed her highest. The contrast was extraordinary. Yet the true victory was not the applause. It was the fact that she no longer needed it. She had already become the person she fought to become long before anyone else finally noticed. The applause eventually faded, but the impact of that afternoon continued spreading throughout the business world for weeks afterward. News outlets published articles. Financial analysts discussed the acquisition. Industry leaders praised the strategy behind it. Everywhere people seemed to be talking about Victoria Hayes. Yet while the public focused on the announcement, Victoria returned to work the very next morning. Meetings still needed to happen. Decisions still needed to be made. Employees still depended on leadership. Success had changed her circumstances, but it had not changed her priorities. Early sunlight filled her office as she reviewed reports. Overlooking the Portland skyline. The city below moved through its normal routine. Traffic crossed bridges. Ferries moved across the river. Office buildings gradually filled with employees beginning another day. Victoria smiled softly as she looked out the window. Years ago, she watched the same skyline from a small apartment while wondering whether her future had disappeared. Now she understood something she could not see back then. The future never disappears. Sometimes it simply waits for courage to catch up with it. Across town, Jason Hayes sat alone inside his office long after most employees had gone home. The announcement replayed repeatedly in his mind. Not because Victoria had become successful. Success alone would have surprised him, but he could have accepted it. What unsettled him was the scale of her transformation. The confidence. The leadership. The respect she commanded. The realization that the qualities everyone admired now were qualities she likely possessed all along. He simply never valued them properly. His office remained quiet except for the distant hum of city traffic outside. For the first time in many years, Jason found himself reflecting not on business strategy, but on personal choices. He remembered dinners she organized. Conversations she initiated. Encouragement she offered during difficult periods of his career. He remembered how often he assumed she would always remain beside him regardless of how little attention he gave her dreams. Regret arrived slowly. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just honest. Meanwhile, Victoria's life continued expanding in ways she never imagined. New partnerships formed. Additional investments followed. Employees across multiple companies benefited from programs she introduced. Leadership development initiatives opened opportunities for younger professionals. She focused on creating environments where talent could grow instead of merely survive. One afternoon, several weeks after the announcement, Richard Coleman visited her office. He carried 2 cups of coffee and the familiar expression he wore whenever he was about to share wisdom disguised as casual conversation. "Do you know what the most impressive part of this entire story is?" he asked. Victoria accepted the coffee. "The acquisition?" Richard shook his head. "No, the growth." Another shake of his head. Victoria laughed. "Then what?" Richard looked around the office before answering. "You never became bitter." The room fell quiet. Victoria considered the observation carefully. Richard continued. "Most people who experience what you experienced spend years trying to prove something." He sat across from her desk. "You spent those years building something." Victoria looked toward the window. The answer came naturally. Because proving people wrong never creates a future. Richard smiled. Exactly. Several months later, a charity leadership gala took place at one of the most prestigious venues in the city. Business leaders, investors, and community figures gathered beneath elegant chandeliers remarkably similar to those from another ballroom years earlier. Victoria attended as a featured guest. Her organization had become one of the event's largest sponsors. As she moved through the crowd greeting attendees, she noticed a familiar face standing across the room. Jason. Their eyes met. This time there were no whispers. No humiliation. No audience waiting for conflict. Just two people whose lives had traveled in very different directions. After a brief hesitation, Jason approached. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. Victoria smiled. "Thank you." For a moment neither spoke. Then Jason nodded. "You built something extraordinary." Victoria appreciated the honesty. It took a long time. Jason looked around the ballroom before returning his attention to her. "I was wrong about many things." Victoria studied his expression. Years earlier, she might have waited for those words. Dreamed about them. Needed them. Now they felt different. Not because they lacked meaning. Because her healing no longer depended on them. "We all learn eventually," she replied gently. Jason smiled sadly. "Some lessons arrive later than others." They spoke for only a few minutes before moving in separate directions. No dramatic confrontation. No revenge. No final victory speech. None was necessary. The truth already existed in plain sight. Later that evening, Victoria stood near a large window overlooking the city. Light stretched toward the horizon beneath a clear night sky. The gala continued behind her. Conversations filled the room. Music drifted softly through the air. She thought about the journey that brought her here. The humiliation. The loneliness. The small apartment. The notebook. The opportunities. The setbacks. The victories. Every step mattered. Not because it led to wealth or influence. Because it led to self-respect. A quiet smile crossed her face as she looked out over the city. She had not returned to reclaim a relationship. She had not built an empire to make someone jealous. She had not succeeded to win an argument from the past. She succeeded because she finally learned her value was never determined by who stayed, who left, who doubted, or who believed. It belonged to her all along. And standing beneath the glow of the city lights, Victoria Hayes realized the greatest triumph was not becoming the woman everyone admired. It was becoming the woman she could admire herself.